Welcome to tonight's live lecture. I'm Patricia Simpson, Director of Political and Online Training here at the Leadership Institute. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We are here with Matthew Hurt. I'll probably be referring to him as Matt for the evening. He is a grassroots organizer, campaigner, direct mailer, jack of all trades within the movement, and we're very excited to have him here tonight to talk about Precinct Organization. Just a reminder, tonight's lecture is live, so you can ask questions at any point during the lecture and simply email them to live@leadershipinstitute.org. Those will come directly to me, and I will be able to ask Matt questions throughout the evening. And rest assured that this is being recorded, and you will be able to access it later in our archives. So I don't want to delay any longer. Matt, what do you have for us tonight?
It's great. Tonight we're going to be talking about Precinct Organization, what you need to do to organize your troops on the ground for your candidate or your cause of your choice. So we'll go ahead and dig right in. There are more than 203,000 precincts in the United States, each with an average of about 1,000 voters, give or take the size of the precinct and the location in the various states. Politically, they represent the building blocks, the smallest unit of an electorate. It can be your neighborhood if you live in a dense community like New York City, or it could be a network of farms if you live in a place like rural Tennessee. But each of these is very important when organizing for your candidate or the campaign of your choice. So there are some simple basics to precinct organization. First, you want to identify the leaders. You want to find who your top lieutenants are going to be, who will go out and knock doors, who will canvass, and who will recruit, train, and mobilize your base and your supporters. Then we're going to talk about identifying voters, going door to door with the canvass program. We'll talk a little bit about calendarizing your precinct operations, what to do, how far out from Election Day, and what you should be planning. And then we'll talk about turnout, how to win on Election Day by bringing those people that you've successfully identified and bringing them to the polls for your candidate or the ballot initiative of your choice. So the top guy in your precinct is going to be your precinct chair. And there are a number of duties and responsibilities of a precinct chair that we'll talk about. They're probably going to serve on your political party's executive committee for the county or local jurisdiction. They will be the party's liaison for that precinct. They're going to host precinct meetings either at their home or a community center or something. And they're going to recruit and train precinct volunteers. You're also going to identify and register voters in your precinct, as well as recruit judges, poll watchers, and campaigners outside of polling locations on Election Day. And they must be familiar with the Help America Vote Act, as well as ballot security measures and things that are state-specific oftentimes that they should know about Election Day. They're also going to work for voter canvassing and voter registration. In addition to identifying those who are already registered to vote, they'll be bringing in people who are like-minded and who want to get involved in the campaign or the ballot initiative. Additionally, they will recruit volunteers to hand out literature at the polls, as well as organize volunteers to get voters to the polls on Election Day. And they will also assist at the headquarters. This is such a critically important aspect of the campaign, is to have someone you can trust and rely on to be your precinct chair, someone who will take your calls at 2 in the morning, who will thoroughly canvass your neighborhood or your community, and who will ensure that the volunteers and other folks who are involved in the campaign turn out your identified supporters on Election Day. So how do you identify and recruit a good precinct captain or a precinct chairman? First of all, in some states, they'll be registered with your political party, be it the Republican Party or the Democrat Party or any number of other parties. They're going to be hyper-activists. They're going to vote in every single election, from the presidency down to local dog catcher. These folks are what we call in the campaign world 4 out of 4 voters. They vote in every single election. They may be a member of a political organization that aligns with your philosophy, the NRA or Americans for Prosperity or Right to Life or Club for Growth. Any of these organizations, it shows that they are much more in tune or plugged in to their voter base or to their philosophy. And they're also potentially going to be a contributor to sympathetic candidates at several levels. Even if the candidate is a sacrificial lamb, I know some of you guys watching live in communities like Arlington, Virginia, or Washington, D.C., or New York City, where conservatives don't necessarily get elected, but it's still very important for us to field candidates, even against someone who is in a very strongly liberal precinct or a very strongly liberal district. And they're going to show leadership characteristics. They're going to be involved in the Lions Club. They're going to be on the board of local charities and organizations. These folks are going to have their pulse on the community, the folks who are plugged in and who are most involved. So how do you assume the responsibility to lead? You should know your precinct. In places like New York City and in Washington, D.C., precincts are very small. Hyper-dense locations with large apartment complexes or homes that are very close together. Or in rural communities, farm communities in the Midwest and other places where it could be just a number of farms, literally just a few hundred voters spread tens or hundreds of miles apart from one another. Now, Utah comes to mind. Rural Utah is an area where the homes are not as close together, and so it may be more difficult to identify your supporters.
Speaking about rural precincts, what is the best approach to canvass, or even the simple thing of identifying a precinct leader in a rural area?
And we'll talk more about this in the coming slides, but it is sometimes impractical or nearly impossible to go home by home identifying your supporters. So what you would have to do, or what would be most convenient, is to simply phone bank. And a lot of this voter information is available through your local county board of elections or your state board of elections. It can be pulled or requested by political parties or candidates. But if it's impractical, if you live, if your closest neighbor is 25 miles away from you, it's probably not going to be practical to go door to door. So a phone bank or something to that effect. Likewise, in a high density population area like New York City or Washington, D.C., you may not always be able to gain access to those communities. There are high-rise apartments that don't allow visitors in other places where it's just more practical to attempt to contact people by phone. And a lot of that, like I said, a lot of that information is available through your county board of election. So your individual, your precinct chairman or your captain is going to know the folks in the precinct. Like I said, they go to the meetings. It's the nice old man who sits at Hardee's every Friday morning with a dozen of his friends, and he knows what's going on in the community. Additionally, they're going to be willing to and must learn the election law and the rules of their political party. This is something that varies from state to state. Virginia's laws aren't the same as Tennessee's, aren't the same as New York's, and you must know and follow those laws very closely. Otherwise, you could find yourself in legal trouble, particularly if your candidate is competitive and the other side gets desperate. Additionally, they should have a relationship with the party and the candidates. They should know the folks who run the local party. They should know the candidates who are running for office, and they should be tapped in to those relationships in those circles. And they should be willing to get out and knock on doors and canvass and reach out to the folks. This isn't someone who is going to manage from afar. This is someone we need on the ground, knocking on doors, meeting with voters, and identifying who they support. So someone who's willing to get their hands dirty and do the dirty work and knock on doors when it's hot outside or when it's raining or when it's snowing. So what exactly is a canvass? A precinct canvass is like a political census. It's going to allow you to gather vital information in order to better identify your supporters and to identify those folks and to make sure they come out on Election Day. For instance, if I were running a canvass in Northern Virginia this year in 2013, I would potentially go door to door and say to Mr. Smith, do you support Ken Cuccinelli for governor or Terry McAuliffe for governor? These are the two major party candidates. And if Mr. Smith said, well, I support Terry McAuliffe, he's the Democrat. All right, well, do you support the Republican or the Democrat for lieutenant governor, and so on and so forth, so you can see who your supporters are. This isn't a campaign opportunity necessarily. You're not trying to get into a debate with these individuals. You just want to figure out who they support or the political party or issues they most align with.
I have a question. Let's say someone is doing a canvass for a particular political party, and they start asking, do you support candidate, this gubernatorial candidate, this lieutenant governor's candidate, this state senate candidate, and they don't align with the political party on every single office that is being run. What do you do with those people? How do you identify them? Do you keep them on your list to contact later, or because they don't align 100% with your particular political party, that you discard them completely?
Sure. Increasingly, American voters are not necessarily identifying themselves with either Republicans or Democrats, and you have a lot of folks who might have voted for Barack Obama at the top of the ticket, but they supported their Republican Senate candidate or their independent congressional candidate, and this is becoming increasingly the case. What you would do is if 3 of the 4 candidates or 3 of the 5 candidates they support align with your political party, definitely put them in the contact list. And then when you go back to actually campaign to these folks, you will try to nudge them in the direction of the other candidates you would support. Likewise, if you worked for, say, a Republican candidate for governor and not the political party, you would just be interested in figuring out if they supported your candidate, and the rest of the ticket wouldn't necessarily matter. In 2010, I ran a state senate race in Maryland, and there was a lot of crossover from minority Democrat voters. It was a Republican campaign. Minority Democrat voters who voted for the Democrat candidate for governor, but they were going to vote for my Republican boss for state senate. And so we turned out those folks on election day for our candidate, even though it didn't necessarily help the other Republican candidates on that ticket. It was, we were trying to turn out our supporters. So it's very important, depending upon which you're working for, a candidate or a political party, there's a different focus. So how would you go about canvassing your precinct? First of all, you want to verify that people voted in past party primaries still self-identify as your political affiliation. And this is fairly easy to ascertain. Like I said earlier, you would just go to the County Board of Elections or your local election body and you would request the data. Sometimes political parties have things like Voter Vault. I know President Obama now has an incredibly advanced voter identification program that they're using now. And so these tools are available either through your political party or your candidate or your local election office. And you just look at those. It'll say, who voted in the Republican primary in 1996, in 1998, in 2000, and 2002. If I'm running a campaign in 2004, I want to reach out to those folks who vote regularly in primaries. These are the folks who are most likely to turn out on election day for you, and you don't want to spend a lot of time reaching out to people who may not even show up to vote for you. So 2 is you're going to identify people who do not vote in primaries but support your political affiliation in the general election. And this happens a lot as well. There are folks who turn out in November of a presidential year, like this past year in 2012, but maybe they don't vote in midterms or they don't vote in primaries in August or beforehand. You still want to identify those individuals and reach out to them at a later date. Number 3, you can identify people who are not registered but would probably support your party. And where I saw this most often going door to door is there'll be a young man or a young lady who just turned 18. Their parents are Republican or Democrat, or they support the candidate that you work for, and they're not yet registered. So it's always a good idea to take voter registration forms, and based on your party or your state's laws, you may be able to register those individuals to vote. In some places, you have to be a registered voter, and you want to make sure you're following the laws for whom you can register or who can take on that responsibility.
I've got a great question from Mark, who's down in Henrico, Virginia, outside of Richmond. Great town. He asked that he and his wife went door to door and canvassed very hard during the last election, and they found that the hardest place to canvass was their own neighborhood because they know people. And I'm sure that your neighbors probably, a lot of the times, they'll be honest with you about some things, but usually your political leanings, people are very secretive about it. What's some advice you would give to Mark and all others that run into the same problem?
Sure. Thanks, Mark, for the question. And it's important in most precincts that you have someone who does understand the precinct. And it's counterintuitive to your question, but you really have to try to sort of pry in and figure that out. A lot of the information you can get before even going to the door. Like I said, you request that information from the County Election Commission, or you go to your political party, and you can see who your friends and neighbors voted for in not who they voted for, but which political party they voted for in the primary. And this is actually something that is being used against mainly conservatives, and was done so in the last election. There are some left-wing groups that are pulling donation information, which is public, and voter information, and mailing neighbors in a particular neighborhood and putting pressure on folks to vote one way or another. But it's definitely information that you can gain before you go to their door, and then you just have to do your best. Some people are not going to be as willing to give out that information as others, and some people will be very shocked. I remember in 2006 I was campaigning in Tennessee, and a woman had just moved from Michigan, and she was an identified Republican primary voter, and that's the type of voter I was going for in 2006. And she was shocked when I knew that she had voted in Republican primaries. And she said, that's my private philosophy. How dare you? And so you occasionally get that, and it's definitely different when it's your neighbor down the street who you may invite over to a cookout. But it's definitely something that you have to try to do. And it's sometimes difficult, Mark. It's a great question, but you may just have to power through it and ask them anyway.
And just a follow-up question. When people do get frustrated time and time again and they just kind of want to give up, what are some words of encouragement that you often give to people, letting them know how important canvassing is? What are the words that you would say to these volunteers?
In 2004, there was a state house candidate just outside Nashville, Tennessee. And the weekend before the election, he did something silly. He went out of town and took his wife on a trip to a riverboat in Mississippi. I remember this very, very distinctly. And on Election Day, 2 days later, he lost by 42 votes. 42 votes. There's a congressional candidate in Utah. This time around, she lost by 768 votes, I believe. So if the precinct is the building block of any campaign, it's the smallest area, these are the places where you'll find 2, 3, 12, 14 votes for your candidate. Every single vote counts. And to understand that, even when you step back and you look at the presidential election, where there were millions of votes cast. In 2000 in Florida is a great example with Ralph Nader on the ballot against Al Gore, and George Bush ended up winning Florida. But it's those tiny, tiny precincts where 12 people voted for Ralph Nader and 15 people voted for Ralph Nader. And so you see it's very, very important to make sure you identify as many of those people as possible and ensure that they turn out to the polls. In 2006, I ran for local office. I was 19 and living in Tennessee, and I lost by 90 votes. But two of my friends, their parents were going to vote in the election, and they ended up walking away because the line was too long. So I had to ask myself, how many people walked away, and how many of my supporters walked away because the line was too long, and where could I have made up that 90-vote difference? And it's really important. At the precinct level, it's where you find the handful of voters that ultimately tip the scale in favor of your ballot initiative or your candidate.
And just one question before we move on to the next slide. Donna asks, how do you get around the party, which is essentially fighting your precinct grassroots efforts? A lot of time there's activists versus parties. That's on both sides of the aisle, 100%. Doesn't matter what political party you're a member of. How do you get around that?
Sure. There's, it's very different between the grassroots of either party and the top-down approach of some political parties or all political parties. And so there are opportunities, like I said, if you can access the voter data. Sometimes you do have to run parallel to the party with which you most align. Sometimes in deep blue states, the Republican Party isn't as effective. The same in deep red states where the Democrat Party isn't as effective. So if you make it a community issue and you identify yourself as conservative and your neighbors are conservative, then sometimes you just have to go outside the party structure. And there's nothing wrong with that. You may have access to fewer resources, there may be less money involved, but it's important that if you've got a voter goal and on election day you want to bring out X number of votes for your candidate, the party may simply be a hindrance. So there are a lot of third party, and when I say that I mean outside organizations that help organize. The Leadership Institute is one that gives valuable training. Americans for Prosperity and others do this as well, where they really help individual activists outside of a political party learn how to reach out and identify those voters. So we do have a few more a few more issues on the how do I canvass my precinct. Number 4 is very important. Update list by correcting or adding voter information and phone numbers. This is one that if you're phone banking and you get a lot of wrong numbers, it means the data is older. If you're going door to door and you're getting a bunch of names of people who don't live at those homes, your data is not up to date. This is always an issue. People are always moving. If the voter data is older than 6 months old, it's probably outdated. And this is what we've seen with Republicans who use voter vault, and I anticipate will be an issue for Barack Obama's organization as well. People are always moving, and names are changing, and phone numbers are changing, and so it becomes more difficult. You want to make sure you have the most up-to-date information. Number 5, register to vote any eligible but unregistered individual in your political affiliation households. That's like I said earlier, if you've got somebody who just turned 18 and November will be their first opportunity to vote in an election and their parents support you or your candidate, register those folks to vote. It's important to turn out, like I said, 1, 2, 10, 12 votes in every single precinct. And finally, find volunteers who will help. This isn't a one-man show. You need as many people helping as often as they can. You can identify folks, give them a title, put them in charge of their neighborhood or put them in charge of a particular street and get them involved. It's so important that this is a team effort. Building coalitions and building networks within your neighborhood and your precinct is so important.
Speaking of volunteers and even paid campaign staff, what should you wear when you're going canvassing?
You should wear relatively comfortable clothes. The male uniform that I use when I'm campaigning in the summer is usually khakis and a polo. Oftentimes your candidate will have a shirt that he or she asks you to wear that identifies you. It's easy to spot you in a neighborhood. I know in 2006, the candidate I worked for in the general election, she had these ridiculously bright yellow t-shirts. But you could spot us from a mile away. You knew immediately that we were campaign volunteers or staffers for that candidate. So it should be comfortable, comfortable tennis shoes. You're going to be walking 1 or 2 or 3 or more miles. So you definitely want to be comfortable but look presentable. You're not going out on a Friday night. You should wear comfortable and sort of loose-fitting clothing, and no tight jeans, no anything that makes it look like you're going to spend a night on the town. You certainly want to be comfortable.
Excellent.
So we'll move on to preparing for the precinct canvass. To get ready for that canvass, you're going to need a number of things. A list of registered voters, and as I said before, you can acquire this either through your party or through the Election Commission. You want the primary voter list. This data is oftentimes one and the same. It comes in the same Excel spreadsheet that's hard to read and fun to go through late at night and delineate who will vote and who won't. A precinct map, there are a number of inexpensive bits of software, or just using Google Maps or whatever, Yahoo Maps or whatever you want to use to print out so your volunteers know where they're going. You can highlight the streets and the neighborhoods. And a computer, obviously, to maintain your files. In electoral politics, data is infinitely important. So to be able to keep that data with you in your campaign on a computer or hard drive is so critically important. And then a precinct calendar, which is going to, from Election Day, from that first Tuesday in November or that first Thursday in August or whenever, to when you start your operations, you want to have everything down so that you can ensure that you're staying on task and you meet your voter identification goals before the election. So your sample canvas script, when you're going door to door, you may have individuals who are uncomfortable speaking with strangers or neighbors, people who don't understand or haven't done this many times. They need something to keep them on track. So it's very simple, canvas script. Hello, my name is Matt. I'm working for John Smith for Dog Catcher. I'm responsible for Jones Street. I just live 2 streets over. I have a few questions. Do you have some time? If no, leave them alone. Walk away. You don't want to anger your neighbors. You don't want to anger potential voters. If you identify them as a no, just leave them alone. If they say yes, though, make sure the information is up to date. If I see John Smith on my voter list, but it's Mary Sue Johansson at the door, obviously John Smith is moved and that is outdated. So I would immediately ask if she is a Republican or Democrat, depending upon the type of campaign I was working for. And if she supported my candidate or my political party, I would immediately try to register her to vote. So you make sure that information is up to date. You just go through the number of questions, depending upon how many questions you want to ask. It shouldn't be much more than 5 or 6 questions. Otherwise, people are doing things in their homes on the weekend. They're grilling out, or they're watching the big game, or whatever. You don't want to bother them for too long. So there are some general rules you want to make sure you follow. Never argue. And I've seen this so many times from enthusiastic volunteers who get a little overzealous and they want to have a back and forth. This is in the mid-90s, the quintessential Pat Buchanan supporter who came down from the mountain. He had his beard, out to here, and he would knock on the door, bang, 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 bang. And if you didn't agree with him, he would shout at you and then run back up to the woods, and you would obviously lose support for your candidate. This happens in every election, overzealous supporters. You're just trying to, in the initial canvass, identify your support. If they don't support your candidate or your cause, leave them alone. Don't try to persuade them. They may be the most ardent of opposition to you, and you don't want to anger them, because then they might essentially work harder against your candidate or your political party. You really don't want to encourage the opposition to every name you identify, they identify another one. It's really retail politics at the local level. I would say spend no more than 5 minutes per household, and this is incredibly difficult for candidates who want to spend 10 minutes, or who want to go in and have a cup of tea, or want to go, watch whatever the family is watching on television on a Saturday, or they want to get out of the rain. It's very important that you stay on task. You have 100 or 200 or 300 names to identify. You don't have time to get into long, drawn-out conversations or go into somebody's home. And for a volunteer, I would say never go into anybody's home. But you don't want to get involved in that. It's going to take too much time away from you. And one thing, if it's somebody who you suspect might not agree with your candidate, they may want to spend time with you at the door anyway to keep you from other doors. So be very aware of that. The other side, on whatever side, may be interested in making sure you don't meet your goal of 50 potential voters in a neighborhood. So it's very important to spend only 5 minutes at a door and at the most, and then move on.
I definitely do that. What do you say to individuals who, I don't want to say aren't carrying their weight, but aren't performing as well as some of your other canvassers, some of your volunteers just aren't hitting the goals on time? What do you do about that?
Not everyone will be as good at canvassing or phone banking or whatever as anyone else. I've never fired a volunteer. And I've had some pretty odd volunteers and some volunteers who didn't necessarily carry their weight. You want to assign someone to them to follow up. Or you would ask them, hey Brian, I noticed you didn't get all of the neighborhood on Saturday. Is there something we could do to help make sure that you get it done next time? But it's very important. These individuals are volunteering their time. They may not be as fast or as good or as enthusiastic as the next volunteer, but their presence on your campaign or with your party is very important. So, follow up with them, be very sincere, and if they need extra assistance or extra time, budget for that and give them someone who will help them along. So the next issue is never try to answer a question that you don't know the answer to. This is very important. You don't want to misrepresent your political...
What was the name of my 4th grade teacher?
Is that...
A question you don't know the answer to.
Excellent. Excellent. So if I'm working for, for Ralph Nader for president, and I get a lady at the door who says, well, what's Ralph Nader's position on X? And I don't know, what are the chances that I might get it wrong? And then she's immediately turned off by that. She doesn't vote for Ralph Nader, and Ralph Nader loses the presidency in 2000. There were a lot of people giving voters the wrong answers about Ralph Nader, apparently. But it's important that if you don't know, it's okay to say, I don't know. I will check with my candidate, I will check with our campaign, and I will get back to you. And make a note on the canvas sheet. Ms. Johnson had a question about the candidate, whether the candidate was pro-life or pro-abortion. We had, this candidate has an issue, a local issue. There are a lot of things that are very hyper-local and sensitive to neighborhoods and communities where a candidate may not necessarily side with his or her party or may have an unorthodox approach to. So you want to make sure you give the right answer. If you don't know the answer, it's okay to say, I don't know. Always travel as a team. I send out guy-girl groups. It's more effective going door to door, one on one side of the street, one on the other. If you have an extra person, you can have somebody in the middle shouting out names and information. It's very important to go in a group, particularly with conservative campaigns where you oftentimes have a lot of homeschool children, and they could be between the ages of 12 and 18, so you need to make sure there was someone who's responsible and who will make sure that they don't get lost or wind up in someone's home. You don't know who your neighbors are necessarily, and you want all of your volunteers to be safe. So that's a very important consideration. Make sure that people go in teams of at least 2. If it's a larger neighborhood, it's certainly okay to send more out together, but make sure they have a buddy and somebody's got a cell phone or some way to contact the campaign or whoever's running the operation. And then finally, know your polling place. That's the question I hear most often, specifically about the mechanics of voting when going door to door. Well, I don't know where I vote. And between every election, most people who aren't voting every year, unless you live in Virginia or some other states, but so they don't always remember where their polling location is. It may have been at Stewart's Creek Elementary School 2 years ago, but now it's at the public library, this year because of budget cuts, and they had to cut the number of voting machines. So make sure you know that information. Make sure you know when the polls open and when they close, and make sure you have basic information about absentee balloting and other things like that as well.
Talking about, you're saying all the things that you have to have at the meeting. How do you actually get people to the meeting? The rule of thumb I always say is you call 100 people, you're going to get 10. Do you just call through all these people's names, or what are your methods?
Sure. You're probably going to know a number of people who are hyperactivists. I know in Northern Virginia, where I live, I've got a core group of friends who it's the same 25 people who will go and work for any conservative candidate, or they'll go to any rally or protest, and I know those folks. And they are as hyperactive as I am. They are as ready to go every single time there's an opportunity to protest or to work for a candidate. We're out there on doors or phone banking. So you're going to know probably a few of these people. With the advent and the expansion of Facebook and social networking, it's the guy down the street who posted about this article about whatever the issue is that you support, whatever this pro-life candidate said, or depending upon your campaign or your candidate. These people are going to be easily identifiable. They've probably worked on campaigns before. Some of them are organic. They just show up and they say, I want to work for John Smith for dog catcher, and you bring those people in. What I did when we worked in Maryland is reached out to teenage Republican clubs in a couple of the high schools, and we asked the leaders of those organizations to come to the meeting. We had pizza. We asked them to bring their friends, and the folks who wanted to get involved in the campaign, we plugged in immediately. But there are plenty of ways to reach out. You're gonna see these people. They're gonna work on campaigns. They're hyperactive. You'll know them because they've gone door to door for candidates in the past, and you've seen them at civic events and other places. So now we're going to talk about the precinct calendar. Dates to consider. It's very important that you're very organized, and if Election Day is November 2nd, then you need to have your folks identified by the middle of the summer and then start turning out that model as you move toward Election Day. Important dates. Election Day, obviously, if it's presidential or congressional, it's likely in November. There may be you may be working for a small town mayor and that election could be in April. Make sure you know when election day is. If there's a primary, you should understand and know when the primary date is. In some states, they have instant runoff, where if you have multiple candidates, you'll have a primary in June, and then if there isn't a clear winner, you'll have another primary in July, and then you'll have a general election later. Understand all those dates is very important. All the dates of party events, if you're a Republican, you likely go to Reagan Day dinners or Lincoln Day dinners. If you're a Democrat in the South, they have Jackson Day dinners. You need to understand and know when the 4th of July barbecue is, so that you can make sure your supporters and your folks are going to these events.
When do you think is the 4th of July barbecue?
It's usually on the 4th of July.
Okay.
Sometimes the weekend before. It depends, but make sure that all these events are in your calendar, that your volunteers know there are plenty of opportunities to get involved, to show up at these events with stickers and shirts and clipboards ready to sign people up for your campaign. Dates of community events. Some communities have zoning issues. There's a particular issue in rural mid-Maryland with a waste-to-energy incinerator. And so if you're running in that community in Frederick, Maryland, you probably need to know when those meetings are, because those individuals who go to those meetings are going to be hyperactive and turned on to that particular issue. It's very important that you have people at all of these events. And then your target dates. When do you want to identify 10,000 or 15,000 supporters? Write that date down and every day work backwards to reach that goal. If my primary is in August, I want to make sure I've identified all my primary supporters by early July, and then I start turning those people out. I hit them again at the doors, go door to door, or phone bank them, and make sure they're ready to vote on election day. So here's an example, just a slide of important dates to know. This is when the polls are open. We see, it looks like LA Elections Division, General Senate District 26. The date of the election is March 19th. It looks like the deadline to file as a candidate is the February 16th, and then when the polls are open. And so this information will be available on your county election website or your State Board of Election website. Immediately, whenever that's available, export that data, put it into your calendar, and put it in big yellow highlighter all over the place. This is the date where we must win on this day, so people understand how far the election is. And in the last days of the 2010 election that I ran, we would put on a whiteboard 11 days till election day, 10 days till election day, and every day we would count down so that volunteers knew just how important it was that they show up and volunteer as often as they could to make sure we turned out our voters.
I have a question. Noticing the calendar, I assume that you put on the calendar 4th of July, important community events. What happens if someone has a college in their district where there are a lot of young people, a lot of potential voters? What do you do then? Do you put the start of classes on the calendar? Do you canvass the campus? What is your suggestion there?
Sure. If you live in a community that is, there are a lot of college students. College Station, Texas comes to mind. My hometown was a big college town. It may behoove you to reach out to those students. And so if there was a big rivalry tonight, UNC and Duke are playing, it would not be a good idea to go door to door in North Carolina, where two big teams are playing. People are going to be distracted by sporting events or whatever. Additionally, there are opportunities to campaign. So if there's a big game between your rival, across the country, you can go to those events. Definitely put those on your calendar, and there are opportunities a number of opportunities to campaign at one particular event for your candidate or your political party. So yes, absolutely. If there's a school in your town, I believe College Station elected a young student from the campus there for city council a number of years ago. Enough students were tired of sort of being pushed to the side in the city, and they came and elected a student member of the city council. So it's very important, as young people are getting active and working in conservative politics. I see so many young conservative activists who want to get involved in the party or in politics. And when I was 19, I ran for county commission, and my volunteers were my classmates. So we went door to door. They were young and idealistic and had strong philosophies like me, and it was very important to reach out to those individuals. So your sample precinct calendar from January to March, if this is a November election, you want to have your precinct caucus. Maybe you get your friends and neighbors together who agree with you. You get them together and you identify who your leaders will be. You identify who will be responsible for various neighborhoods. You will divvy up the precinct to make sure everyone knows what their responsibilities are. Develop a strategic plan. When are we going to have this major neighborhood? There's a neighborhood just outside Nashville, Tennessee, in Laverne. It's a community just outside Nashville that is the largest residential community, I believe, in the state of Tennessee. There are thousands of homes, tens of thousands of voters, and that's a huge chunk of the electorate in local districts, in your local state house district or a state senate district. So you have to break that up, and if you develop a strategic plan for your precinct, you'll know how to break that up, who gets which streets and which sections of the neighborhood. It's very important to have all that laid out and organized at the very beginning. You would organize meet and greets with your neighbors and have your first meeting. Like I said, find out who's going to volunteer and get involved in the campaign, and then recruit and train volunteers. If you've got a local Tea Party group or a local civic association who wants political training, the Leadership Institute has a fantastic grassroots department that will travel to your community and train your activists. I've been all over the country to far-flung places as Winnemucca, Elko, and Fallon, Nevada, to reach out to grassroots activists who want to get involved and who want to know more about the process. And there are other organizations that provide this training as well, oftentimes for free or at a significantly reduced rate. So this is a map of a particular precinct. You see on the left side of the map, that's a large neighborhood. On the right side, it seems to be commercial properties. I don't necessarily like the satellite view personally, but this allows you to break down who gets which streets, who gets which communities, which neighborhoods, and it's very important to have, when you have your walk sheet, to have at least a map of your precinct. So what does your precinct strategic plan look like? Number one, what districts overlay the precinct? There will be a number of school board districts. There'll be a number of state senate or state house districts. And in states where it's hyper-partisan, the gerrymandering may be so insane that you would have, one state house candidate who represents you on your street, and 2 streets over, it's another member of the state house or state senate who represents your neighbors. So you need to understand which districts overlay the precinct. Number 2, what is the voter history previously of a specified number of elections? You can figure out what the propensity of your precinct to vote one way or the other is. If you live in a strong Republican community, you know that your battle is going to be in the primary if you're running a Republican candidate. If you live in a 50-50 split community, you know that it's going to be equally, or if not more important, to make sure you turn out folks on election day. And it's important, 3, to understand voter demographics. You have to understand, if you live in a place like Arlington where we're located, on election day, a lot of Democrats come out and vote. A lot, like 3-to-1 Democrats to Republicans. So you have to understand the political reality of your neighborhood and of your community. 4, what are the hot button issues? As I referred to earlier, waste-to-energy incinerator in Frederick, Maryland is one. New schools being built is another. These are oftentimes hyper-local. They are transpartisan. That means it can appeal to either Democrats or Republicans, and this is an issue that a candidate, say you have a Republican candidate, for instance, in 2010 in Maryland and Frederick, who opposed construction of a waste-to-energy incinerator, you can bring people over from the other side who wouldn't vote for you on a number of other issues, but they agree with you on the local issues, sort of the not in my backyard NIMBY type issues that you'll see at the local level.
I have a couple questions here. First one is from Joy, and this is talking about, you talked about figuring out which precincts you want to go to. What do you do when you don't have enough volunteers to cover all the precincts that you intend to cover? Which ones do you focus on?
I would say that you're never going to have the absolute number of volunteers that you want. Just as in a campaign, you're not going to have all the money that you want to run that last ad or to do that last robocall. You have to make do with what you have. That's the political reality. So for instance, if you're running a Republican campaign, what I would do is identify those precincts which voted most heavily Republican in the previous 2 or 3 elections, and I would target those precincts. I would prioritize those precincts. And then as the calendar, if you calendarize or you prioritize your caucus and your canvass, then you'll be able to, as time wears on, as you get close to the election, you may be able to go and pick up some more of the swing precincts. What I wouldn't do is, if you're working for a Republican and likewise for a Democrat, is go to an incredibly Democratic precinct or a Republican precinct if you're working for Democrats and waste your time hitting 1 or 2 homes in a neighborhood. You want to maximize as many potential supporters as possible. And if you're going into a neighborhood with 350 homes and only 20 of them are identified as your potential supporters, that's probably a waste of your time. So prioritize your precincts. Go to the ones where they're most likely to.
How many times should you hit a precinct?
Sure. You want to identify. The first opportunity is your canvass. Simply identifying who your voters support, and you just ask them a question. You're not campaigning. You just want to figure out who they support, which party they support. That's your initial identification canvass. Once you've identified as many precincts as you can, then you go back with phone banking or door-to-door and you campaign and you hit those individuals you identified as your supporters. You remind them when election day is, and then you find those persuadables, the folks who, if you work for a political party, maybe they didn't support everybody on your party's ticket, but they supported most of them. You go to those individuals and you say, well, can we count on your support for governor, lieutenant governor, and you know, how about that attorney general race? Can I swing you for the attorney general race as well, and try to get a commitment out of those individuals? But it's very important to identify them first, and then go back the second time, either door-to-door or phone banking, and energize them and remind them that election day is right around the corner. If you have time to hit a particular precinct 2 or 3 times, that's great, but you don't want to spend too much time and too many resources hitting the same house 4 or 5 times. You know, if you've identified John Smith as a voter and then you told him when election day is, you can have a GOTV outfit 72 hours beforehand, but you don't want to send somebody to that house over and over and over again. The final issue for your precinct strategic plan is what local organizations participate politically. Is there a Lions Club? Is there a Tea Party group? Is there a radical environmentalist organization that, you know, wants to replace humans with trees? You know, you have to understand what organizations are operating in your district and in your precinct, and try to reach out to those which would be favorable to your cause. If you're supporting a conservative candidate, if there's an active Tea Party group in your community, they may be able to reach out and work with your campaign or work with your candidate. So you definitely want to build coalitions and bring people into the fold of your campaign. And you also want to know what the other side is doing. So if you know, there's a hyperactive teachers association opposing every conservative candidate that comes along, I want to know who they are. I want to know how serious they are and how much money they spend at the precinct, so that I can equally energize my supporters and my voters to work for my boss or my candidate. Then we have just a quick chart of special election results from February 19th election. You can see, you know, these are tens and dozens and hundreds of votes where if I energize 12 people per precinct, I'm going to swing the election in my favor. So it's very important that you're very thorough in your canvassing and identifying your supporters. Like I said, in 2004, that State House candidate in Tennessee who lost by 42 votes, he probably could have identified 62 or 82 or 92 voters the weekend he went out of town and brought them to the polls, and he would have won. So your precinct calendar from April to August, if you've got a November election, you do your precinct canvass, identify and register to vote all the party voters if you're working with the party. You can use door-to-door and phone banking to identify these individuals, like I said, in high-density communities where you can't get into people's communities and apartments, or residential communities where the homes are miles and miles apart, it's more practical to phone bank. You're not using as much time going door to door. And then solicit committee membership. If folks are favorable to your cause or your candidate, get them to join you. One of the greatest things about my candidate in 2010 was when he found favorable people in a neighborhood, he would invite them to join him to finish door knocking, going door to door in that neighborhood. And it was great because people knew that individual. They could vouch for that candidate. It's really a great opportunity to get the community involved and find potential leaders.
I just want to remind everybody that we only have a few minutes left. So if you can get your questions in while Matt wraps up, we will ask him your questions.
Great. Distribute literature from April to August, going door to door, information on the party or the candidates, polling locations, election procedures, and the laws. This is important. You should always have some sort of literature when you're going door to door. There are special projects you can participate in, welcoming new households, Operation Patriot, which is a great letter that you would send to individuals who have a flag in their front yard, host a barbecue or a picnic. These are all important events that you can do that brings out new people and supporters. You can identify potential volunteers. Here's a sample precinct list. This is usually what it looks like. Their voter ID, which isn't necessarily important to you all the time, but their name, their address, their date of birth, whether they're male or female, and which party they identify with. Not all states force you to register by party. For instance, the state of Virginia, on primary election day, I can go into the elementary school where I vote and I can say, I want to vote in the Republican primary or the Democrat primary. And so I'm not registered by party, but on a precinct list, it will show the parties in the primaries that I vote for. So if they're mostly Republican, if you're working for a Republican, if they're mostly Democrat, if you're working for a Democrat, you'll want to reach out to those individuals. From September to November, this is Canvas Part 2. This is where you're going back to the folks who are favorable to your candidate or your party, and you're reaching out to them. You're reminding them of the election. You're going to talk to your undecideds and your persuadables, the folks who they maybe support your party most of the time, but they don't support your candidate. Try to swing them in your favor. This is also door-to-door and phone banking. This is also when you'll do absentee ballot drives. Now we don't have election day. We have election month where people can vote for 2, 3, 4 weeks leading up to the November election. So more and more people are taking that opportunity. You want to make sure you identify them quickly. Also, you'll want to put out your yard signs then. Some communities have laws saying you can't have yard signs further out than 60 or 90 days. You want to make sure that your yard signs are out within the time frame that's allowed by law and that would do the most good. When your opponent is driving through a neighborhood and they see Joe Smith for dog catcher, Joe Smith for dog catcher, it's a psychological hit on your opponent. And you want to make sure as many signs go up as possible in that small window between September and Election Day. This is also when you do more special projects, back to school nights. You go to sporting events and other things, neighborhood parties to turn out your supporters and make sure they have the information they need for Election Day, homecoming parades, and other events. Then Election Week, you've got your GOTV headquarters. You can use someone's house or office. You need multiple phone lines to reach out to identified supporters. Cell phones, a campaign can buy a number of track phones from a large retail store and use those for the duration of the campaign. Google Phone also has, you can assign phone numbers and other things. They should understand where the polling station is so they can make sure that anybody who asks knows where to vote on Election Day. Have 2 volunteers at all times outside, handing out literature and talking to those individuals who show up on Election Day and they haven't quite made up their mind. You have one extra opportunity to swing them in your favor. Always have a lawyer on hand. It's 2013. We're in the age of election lawsuits, and so you want to make sure somebody who understands the election law is on your side. Have somebody who you can call who is ready to go. I know the RNC and the DNC do this on Election Day. They have thousands of lawyers ready to go at a moment's notice who can deploy. In 2000 in Florida, planes full of attorneys flew down to Florida to make sure that each party was being treated fairly in Florida. And then one person inside checking off voter names. When people come in and vote, Just take them off your list so that you don't contact them anymore, so that you can focus on the folks who haven't voted. And then a group of phone bankers at the headquarters throughout the day.
Just of this being your last slide, I just want to go to some questions just to wrap it all up. We have quite a few, so I want to get through them as fast as we can. First question, should precinct committeemen also hold office like county board member or treasurer? Should they be office holders, or can they be regular old citizens?
They can be office holders, and oftentimes the folks who are most engaged are going to hold offices within the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, or they're going to hold elected office. It depends. You know, depending upon your resources, the number of volunteers you can muster. I'll take anybody on a campaign who wants to volunteer for my candidate or my cause. If you want to come in and spend 3 hours a week helping out, and your name is Senator, John Smith, that's great. That title is fine, and we'll give you another title and get you involved in the campaigns that I work for.
This is a question about independence, saying you shouldn't. This person wants to know, should you focus on them at all? Because you're saying that if you're a Republican, say you're focusing on the hard R's as much as possible, shouldn't you be focusing on independence when you're canvassing a precinct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in the canvass part 2, you go to the persuadables and the independents. Increasingly, more and more Americans are identifying as independents, and reach out to them. They don't always agree with Republicans or with Democrats on every issue, but they have a party that they probably mostly align with. As a conservative voter, I tend to find my home in the Republican Party, but on local issues, it really varies. So certainly reach out to independents and folks who don't necessarily identify with a party to get them to vote for your candidate. Absolutely.
This person wants to grow their email lists. Is it possible to grow your email list by canvassing? Do you ask for email addresses, or should you? Can you do canvassing by email? Can you obtain third-party email lists?
You can. In a lot of local races, it wouldn't be practical really to obtain third-party email lists, and some will not relinquish their list to anyone. But it's certainly data that you can collect going door to door. I would be interested in the correct voter name at the door, the address, the phone number, the email address. Email is increasingly important, and you can use important tools like MailChimp to email them and follow up. Yeah, absolutely. I would try to get email addresses and do it that way. And people tend to grow. You've got an influence of friends and supporters who you email regularly anyway. Put them on your campaign list and send them campaign emails.
The last question. And again, thank you everyone for all the questions. They've been really great. I wish we could get to a few more, but we'll email you your answers. The last question is, what is a lot of people are saying that the program that they're given by their political party is not very reliable. Do you have any other suggestions for canvassing technology that people can use?
Oh yeah, party platforms, party data is not always reliable. Speaking from the perspective of having used something like Voter Vault or something else, it's not always up to date. It's not always user friendly. Find something that works for you. If it's as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, the data is yours, is your candidates, is your campaigns, and if you are the king of that data. So it behooves you, it's up to you to make sure it's up to date, it's as accurate as possible, and that it reflects the supporters that you have. The campaign that I worked on in 2010, we had voter data from as far back as 1998 of people who said, yes, I support that candidate. And we knew that they were identified supporters. And we knew people from as far back as 98 who were absolutely turned off by the candidate as well. So, yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you for joining us tonight. It was very informative, and I hope that everyone at home learned a lot. I've gotten a lot of questions asking if this will be archived. It 100% will be. It should be available to watch Friday afternoon at www.leadershipinstitute.org/activism-on-demand. Did you have?
I would just like to add, I love helping conservative activists all over the country. So if you found something valuable here tonight, if you search for me on Twitter, I'm always involved here at the Leadership Institute, and I want to help you guys get elected. I want to help your candidates get elected all over the country. So you just search for me there, as well as on the leadershipinstitute.org. We would love to help you out.
Yeah, and I can definitely get you Matt's contact information. And also, if you want to bring this training to your town, I know we had a question about that. How do we get the training brought to your area so you don't have to watch it on the computer or you don't have to travel all the way to DC? We can absolutely do that, and you can contact me about that. Again, you can just email live@leadershipinstitute.org and speak directly to me, and I'll get you in contact with those that are in charge of that program. But again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Hope it was informative. You can join us again in 2 weeks. We're going to be covering building coalitions, which is going to be a really great topic, and that is on Wednesday, February 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Hope to see you then, and until then, have a great night. Bye. All right, that was really